Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And as we continue our discussion of linguistics, we're going to get into all kinds of things. We're going to talk about language, language systems, dogs, beasts, semantics, the Lord's Prayer, dancing macaronis, goths, and kurgans. And let's go ahead and get started. We've already discussed phonetics a little bit and a little bit of morphology, but we're largely going to skip over that. What we're going to do right here is discuss semantics. We're going to talk about what meaning is and what it could mean. For instance, the sign and the signified. Now, what is semantics? Semantics concerns the use of meaning in language, generally at the level of the word itself, which is, the technical term is lexical semantics. But it can also extend into phrase structures, grammars, and even whole texts. For starters, we need to understand that our language doesn't always clarify. Language can often be used to obfuscate and offer alternatives and answer questions you don't want answered. Speakers often cover up as much as they reveal. And in particularly, one of the things that semantics focuses on is the relationship between the sign and the signified, between the word and the object. Right up above me, you have the sign, which is dog, written in the IPA. And up above me, you have what that symbol signifies. The dog. Is that a dog? For our purposes here, it's a dog. The dog is the signified. The word is the sign. Deer, sign, signified. Now, traditionally, it's been argued that the relationship between sign and signified is completely arbitrary, that there is no necessary relationship. However, this has been challenged somewhat in the last decade or so by linguists who argue that we have greatly underappreciated the concept of semantic shift in connecting sign and signified, and that there, in fact, is a relationship between the sign and the signified, between deer and the object that we're referring to, and that this semantic shift takes place over a language's lifetime. And a semantic shift is when the signified object of the phonetic sign changes over time. And sometimes words have very strange origins. Sometimes the sign chosen to represent the signified can come from often an unexpected source. For instance, the reason why we refer to Native American birds as turkeys by the name of a country in the Middle East. And this actually comes from the 17th century. And on their arrival in the Americas, the early English colonists had no idea what to call that thing on the upper left. I mean, what do you call that thing? They'd never seen one before. They had seen something that looked like it. It did resemble these type of birds that were being imported into Northern Europe and England. Today, we call them African guinea fowl. And there's an African guinea fowl right up above me. So guinea fowl are from Africa, but they are traded into Europe through the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Hence, throughout 17th century England, today we call them African guinea fowl, but back in the 17th century, the English referred to them as Turk birds or turkey birds because they're sold to them by Turkish merchants. And when the Pilgrims and the Puritans and these poor indentured servants showed up in Virginia and they saw those things, they're like, well, that kind of looks like those Turk birds. So that's how they applied this sign from an African guinea fowl onto a Native American bird. And the colonists simply began to call the animal the turkey. And that's how we end up with a Native American bird named after a country in the Middle East. Here's another example, the relationship between the sign and the signified. This is getting into the etymology of words. And this word was invented in 1947. And it was invented in one of the first computers, which was a big machine called the Harvard Mark II. And what happened with the Harvard Mark II is that a moth flew into the machine, into these bright vacuum tubes, and it slammed into the electrical system, killed the moth, shorted out the entire computer. So the engineers and programmers start taking apart the Harvard Mark II, looking for what had damaged the machine, why the machine couldn't run its program. And they found it. A bug in the system. And there is the actual bug itself taped to their work log. So before they started up the sequence, they said, well, we have to make sure that no moths are flying into our giant computer running off vacuum tubes. So basically, before starting any new program, they would open up the machine and look for bugs. They would debug the computer. Hence, bug now refers to any error, not just an insect, but it refers to any programming error or any error in the software is a bug, named after a little moth that fried himself in 1947. Let's go back to our connection between deer and these animals with antlers that live in the woods, those things on the left, the signified. Now, the word applies to these animals because it went through a process of semantic shift in the late Middle Ages. Now, in Old English, the word dior did not refer to that animal. It referred to any animal that lived in the wild forest. In fact, in modern German, there's a related word called Tier, which still refers to all wild animals in the forest. However, after 1066, these group of people invade England called the Normans, and we're going to meet these guys in a tick as well. They overrun England and they add a bunch of French and Latin to the English language. And in this case, they introduce a word from the French, bête, and that comes from Latin bestia. So the English largely adopt the new word. Any animal that lives in the woods is a beast. But they still keep the Old English dior, except they limit it to the most important forest animal, the deer. And that's how a dior becomes a deer. Thus, the relationship between the sign and the signified is not always arbitrary, but signs possess a long and complicated relationship with each of their signified objects or actions. It doesn't seem to be a completely arbitrary relationship. And indeed, some signs seem to possess an onomatopoeic relationship with their signified. Let's take the words in various languages for the object on the left. That cat. In English, it is a cat. In French, a chat. In German, a Katze. In Russian, a kot. In Chinese, a mao. And in Arabic, gita. You see a lot of similarities, even in widely separated languages, for cat. Because largely the similarity between the words is too close for any linguistic borrowing. And therefore, it must be based on the intrinsic properties of the animal itself, probably related to the sound it makes, a meow, or a cat, or a gat. So the animal is named largely off of the sound it makes. It's a kitty. It's just a little kitty. Okay, anyway. Furthermore, there are culturally specific semantics come into play as well. And this is when words reflect or reveal a value or quality that is specific to that culture. Certain words arise or are created to speak to very specific situations taking place in the country at that time. And these words generally do not translate well into other languages. Take a recent English word, the term McJob, as in, hey, I'm working at the mall, but you know, it's just a McJob. I'm probably going to quit in September. McJob. And if you're an American, you probably know exactly what I mean by that, which is this new word, McJob, is a unique word in American English. And it basically refers to, and it says something about our culture too. It refers to these low-paying, low-status jobs with very little future, no benefits, and essentially cheap, temporary, disposable employment. It's a McJob, like a job at McDonald's. Most people are going to take them, but they're not going to take them for very long. And it's not expected that the job is going to do much for you other than provide, a paycheck. And there's a lot of uniquely American words, and here are some of them, all the way from blogs, fanboys, my favorite, which is called a Mondegreen. A Mondegreen are misheard lyrics from a song. This is, of course, the most famous Mondegreen is from Jimi Hendrix, where he sings in the song, "Excuse me while I kiss the sky." But most people hear Jimi Hendrix and think he says, "Excuse me while I kiss this guy." So, not judging. And here's another particular piece of American slang: a Christmas bogus. That's one I That's one I know. A Christmas bogus is when you receive nothing from your employer at Christmas. You know, what did you get for Christmas? Nothing but a Christmas bogus. And there's a bunch over there on the left. You know, getting wrecked, a dude, sick, basic, Uber, boo, money. If something is money, that means it's quality. So you have a lot of these very culturally and historically specific words. These are words that we're using now and that we probably will be abandoned in the future, just like a lot of words from the past have been abandoned. I mean, I can speak about, you can use 70s slangs like, you know, jive turkey. And you might even know what I'm talking about. I could even use slang from the 40s and 50s, you know, where I can sit on my Davenport and listen to the hit Parade, maybe get a cool glass of buttermilk from the icebox while I enjoy a plate of Hydrox. Let's see if you can figure out what I mean by that. But we can even go farther back and we can solve one of the great lyrical mysteries of American culture with that fellow on the left. And he is a dancing macaroni. So, all right, you're thinking, okay, Keith, what the hell is a dancing macaroni? Well, we have to talk about 18th century slang. In the 18th century, there were these, I would say, equivalent of hipsters in London and in the big cities, and this was copied in America. They were basically very, very fashionable young men. And these young men would follow all of the fashion trends of the continent, France, Italy, where they would wear the powdered wigs, the fancy breeches, the tights, and the buckled shoes. And they're very fashionable. They're very, very fashionable. And these very hip, very fashionable, very foppish young men would usually associate in these private clubs. There were private clubs dedicated to the eating, or ostensibly dedicated to the eating of exotic foreign cuisine. And that usually meant Italian food, specifically pasta. And at the time, all pasta was known as macaroni. Hence, to be macaroni was to be very fashionable, to be very hip, to be very self-conscious of who you are, how you're dressing, and how other people are treating you. And it was used as both something that people wanted to be, as well as used as kind of an insult. Someone would dress up very fashionable, go to their local exotic food club and say, I look so macaroni today. And other people would also make fun of them. They would see these very super fashionable young men and go, oh God, he thinks he's so macaroni. And the term largely faded after the revolution. In the 19th century, it was almost completely forgotten. Yet, it occurred in the lyrics of the songs today. And hence, we still sing these Revolutionary War songs, even though some of the words have completely lost their meaning. For instance, Yankee Doodle Dandy. Yankee Doodle went to town riding on his pony, stuck a feather in his cap, and called it macaroni. They're using a slang word for fashionable from the 18th century. And of course, he is an object of great mockery because he doesn't really know what. He's not macaroni. I just tell you that he's not macaroni. And we can apply this to other cultures as well. English is not unique in this way. Other cultures have very culturally specific words. Let's take German, for instance. And this is actually a word in German that has largely moved over in the English language. People in English use the word Schadenfreude. It is a German word. And Schadenfreude is right there. It's when you take pleasure in the misfortunes of others. You know, you're walking down the street and you see a guy slip on ice with a full cup of coffee and bust himself on the sidewalk. And you kind of give a little chuckle. That little flash of joy, that's Schadenfreude. All right? Comes from the German, and it says something about the Germans. Also, here's another good German word that maybe we should think about taking over from them as well. It's a very good word. The German word is Buckfischengescheit. And Buckfischengescheit, literally translated, if my translation is correct, is a face that is in need of a fist. You see some smug, soft, pompous jerk, and you don't even know this person. You don't know anything about this person. but your overwhelming urge is to just put a fist right into their face. That's Buckfish. And yeah, it says something about the Germans, and probably says something about me. I'm sure Adam is fine. He'll be fine. At any rate, languages change over time, sometimes quite dramatically. And because we have these long literary traditions in Western languages, we can actually look to see how entire languages, not just words are falling in and out of favor, but entire grammatical lexicons are coming in and going away. And some of the ways that languages change is quite dramatic over time. I don't know if you've ever had Beowulf inflicted on you, but Beowulf was written in Old English. And it's almost a completely different language. And if you've ever tried to read Beowulf in Old English, it's very, very difficult. Now, I'm not going to touch with Beowulf. We'll stick with something a little simpler. We're going to take the Lord's Prayer. We can look at versions of the Lord's Prayer going back 1,000 years and look at how English has changed, how we go from contemporary to early modern English. That's Elizabethan English, if I'm not mistaken, the language of Shakespeare, all the way back to Middle English in the Middle Ages, all the way back to Old English, English before the Norman conquest. And I would try to read these to you, but I'm not very good at it. And besides, I know someone else who is.
All right, modern English. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Now the Middle English. Just a moment here. Okay. Our Father, that art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come to, be thy will done, in earth as in heaven. Give to us this day our bread over other substance, and forgive to us our debts, as we forgive to our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. And now Old English. Father Uren, who they art on heaven, see the name Jahan, to be kumelendricha, geworden den wille, an erdan swaswa on heaven. Jonne gedank wannetjen da sule as te die, and forgive us urigiltas swaswa we forgive at ungritheldum. En nu gelat du en kostnungen ak aluses avive. Soflicha. Thank you.
This brings us to historical linguistics. Historical linguistics, there's a book written by one of my old professors right up above me. Historical linguistics consists of viewing the development of human languages over time and being able to reconstruct extinct languages in the distant past, even when we don't have literature or copies of them. It involves documenting similarities in modern languages and then applying some statistical math to estimate the times of past divergences. And we'll do this together for a very, very simple pair of examples. And it's already known that certain languages share close similarities. For instance, here's 5 words from 5 European languages: English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian. And it's father, mother, toy, horse, and book. And you can see them in English: father, mother, toy, horse, and book. But as we trace these across different languages, we have English father, but padre in Spanish, pai in Portuguese, per in French, and then padre in Italian. And you can see English doesn't resemble those other words at all. And the same is true of toy and horse and book. That Spanish and Portuguese and French and Italian all have great similarities with their words. And this strongly suggests that all 4 of these languages came from a similar tongue. So theoretically, we could take the similar words and reconstruct the sort of proto-language that is behind Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian. For instance, father. We have padre, pai, per, and padre. So we could hypothesize that there's an ancient word, and we would look at the common elements in each of these 4 languages and assume that the distant ancestor of this word, before people changed it over thousands of years, would be the similar elements. So we're going to take a P, we're going to take an A, we're going to take a D, and we're going to take an R. We're going to put a little superposition asterisk to show that this is not an actual word. This is a reconstruction of a word. So we have padre. For mother, we can do the same thing. Madre, mai, mer, madre, we can put those together and we have an M-A-D-R, mater. And we can look at all the similarities in these languages and we can rebuild this language. For instance, let's just call this language Proto-Southern European. But of course, we don't actually need to do this. This is just a hypothetical exercise in how this is done. All of these European languages, all of these Southern European languages derive from a common language of the Roman Empire. They all come from Latin. You know, our hypothesized Proto-Southern European is simply Latin. And we've got a lot of Latin in the literature. And the Latin for mother and father is pater and mater. So as you can see, we're not far off in our reconstruction. So pater and mater are not too dissimilar. The system actually works. You can rebuild extinct languages based on similarities. And in fact, if we take these Latin languages, these Romance languages, and we combine them together, we plot them on a map, we get the map up above. So all of these languages derived from Latin are all quite similar. Counting dialects, there are roughly 14 Romance languages still spoken in Europe. All of them are descended from the old Imperial Latin. This includes French, Italian, Portuguese. It also includes Occitan, Catalan, Sicilian dialects, and all of the various flavors of Romanian. Altogether, all of those languages together form what's called a language family, a group of similar languages which derive from a common language in the past. Now, we dealt with Southern Europe. Let's deal with Northern Europe. Let's go ahead and approach the languages of Northern Europe in the same way. And here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 languages. Father, mother, I, foot, 1, 3 month. Okay? So we've got English, Danish, Dutch, Norwegian, Icelandic, Irish Gaelic, and Old Scots. And what we can see here is some languages are closer to the other. English father is quite close to the German Vater, which is quite close to the German Vater, but is completely dislike the Irish Alhar. Well, the Danish is Fader, so we're getting close again, but then we've got the Scots Altar. But the Scots word for father isn't like the English word, it is like the Gaelic word. So Scots and Gaelic must be related, as German, English, Dutch, and Danish are. And so we have these 7 words in these 8 languages. We can see that there are clearly 2 related language families. And what I would advise you to do is to just look at these and group them. Which languages are most similar to the others? And which languages are different? And in fact, even the Germanic languages can be sorted into 2 sections. So pause the video right now and do this little exercise in your notebook. I'm not going anywhere. I'm right here, trapped in a little yellow box, just drinking my soda. Ready? Let's see if your results correlate to mine. Or you can just look it up on Google. So basically what we have here is 2 language families, and one language in these language families has 2 different subsets. Right to the left of me, you can quite easily say that Irish Gaelic and Old Scots are very closely related languages. And in fact, they belong to the Celtic language family. But the Germanic languages up above are not only similar from father, mother, I, foot, 1, 3 month, but as you can see, they can even be divided into 2 subfamilies. You have a Western Germanic and a Northern Germanic set. Icelandic and Norwegian on one hand, English, German, Dutch, and Danish on the other. And in fact, if we can look at all of the Germanic languages, we can see that there are roughly 14 Germanic languages, 13 living languages, and 1 extinct one. And they can actually be grouped into 3 subfamilies: Western Germanic, Northern Germanic, and Eastern Germanic. And there is actually one of the languages that's not on this chart, which is a Germanic language which is spoken in Africa called Afrikaans. And most of these languages are spoken today, with the exception of the extinct language Gothic and the Eastern Germanic languages, which have largely ceased to exist. So let's pause for a moment and let's go back to the Lord's Prayer. Let's actually look at this extinct German language. And we actually, because of course of religious liturgies, we have surviving copies of this dead language. Let's listen to the Lord's Prayer in Gothic and see how many words you can pick out.
The Lord's Prayer. Atta unsar, thu in himina. Wich nenamothin. Quime, fiurina susfins. Werthe, wiljathins. Swe in himina, yah ana erthe. Chlef unsarana thana, sindinan. Gif uns hima, dala. Yah aflet uns thati, skulan siyem. Swas we yahwis, afletam, fem skulam unsarem. Yah ni bringes, uns in, frest dunie. Applossi, uns af thama, uwilin. Und Athena ist Theodangardi, Yah macht. Yah wolthus in ewins.
There you go. Gothic. Now, one of these Germanic languages is called Frisian. And Frisian is spoken only by a few thousand speakers. It's located in the northern sections of the Netherlands on these group of islands off the coast. And there are some smiling Frisians up above me. And I'm going to read you some Frisian. There it is on the lower left. And I want to see if you can understand any words of Frisian that I'm speaking. So the first sentence. 3 white books. Second sentence. Bread, butter, and green cheese is good English and good Fries. Because Frisian is the closest language that is related to English. It's a close cousin of English in terms of language families. And if you are a native English speaker and you want to learn another language very, very easily, learn to speak Frisian. Of course, it's only good in one tiny part of Europe, but still, you can speak another language. You can speak Frisian. Maybe it'll look good on a CV. And learning Frisian would be just a matter of expanding the vocabulary, learning a few new grammatical words, and learning how to spell things. Now, getting back to English, English is fairly unique among languages. It's the largest language ever conceived of. English has a comprehensive vocabulary of more than 250,000 words. And this is largely due to 2 factors. One of the reasons English is so gigantic, it's the largest language ever created in terms of vocabulary. This is largely due to 2 factors. And one is historical. And what happened is in 1066, those Normans that we mentioned earlier, and the Normans are a really unusual group of people. They are a Frankified group of Norsemen. They're Vikings who learned to speak French and then invaded England. Anyway, the Normans spoke French and Latin, and they imposed French and Latin on the English countryside, forever changing Old English. It's one of the reasons you couldn't pick out a lot of words from the Lord's Prayer in Old English. The result effectively doubled the size of the English language, where you had both Old English words and new French Latin words, and both would be used simultaneously. And the new language that emerged was called Middle English, and it used large portions of both languages. French and Latin words dominated government and legal terms, and in fact, our legal codes reflect this old Norman conquest to make sure that the people being charged for a crime understood what they were being charged with. It became the custom in English to read them their crime in both the old language and the new one. Hence, that's why it's breaking and entering. One is of French origin, the other is Old English origin. And that's why often you have crimes in the English common law have two names. And this is from the Old English brecan and the Anglo-French entrar, breaking and entering, drunk and disorderly. All of these assault and battery. This is all comes from the Norman conquest 1,000 years ago. The second reason that English exploded is that, again, remember that all utterances possess a social meaning. The way you speak doesn't necessarily say where you're from. It also indicates your position in society, the social class and position of the speaker. And for centuries, English possessed a very, very strict caste system. And social class was often expressed through the use of languages. Now, in non-English languages, this is generally done through grammar and declension. For instance, if you are an elegant, sophisticated, and high social class Spaniard, you're going to use grammatical forms that most people don't use. You're going to use vosotros. You're going to speak with a lisp. And you'll use perfectly the subjunctive and imperfect forms. And in Spanish, you express social class through the use of elaborate grammatical constructions. We didn't do that in English. In English, we crushed grammar to the most basic construction you can have. But because we reduced grammar to as simple as we could get it, social class still had to be displayed. And it was displayed through the acquisition of large amounts of vocabulary. As the social structure in England grew more and more rigid, as it ossified, the language itself went through explosive growth. To keep track of this expanding languages, English scholars began to compile dictionaries. And in fact, dictionaries became something of an English passion in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. It's a way to keep track of this explosion of the vocabulary. And by basic word count, English became the largest language ever known. It's possible that there's larger languages that have gone extinct, but it's unlikely. And this explains the preoccupation with dictionaries in English. Some languages don't even have dictionaries. There's just no need to it. I mean, the vocabulary is not very large, and everyone knows what everybody means. But in English, where your social class is indicated by the use of fancy words, to make sure everyone's using the fancy words correctly, people needed an expert to consult. They needed dictionaries. And starting in the 17th century, dictionaries become more and more popular as people who want to achieve or want to appear higher status start learning fancy new words. And in fact, one of the things that we joke about today are people who misuse, SAT words, who misuse fancy words and look very, very silly doing so. Now, for instance, we have the single most comprehensive dictionary of the English language is the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary. It was launched in the mid-19th century, and the goal was to create a dictionary of every single word used by English speakers. And the project was colossal. The project took generations. There's the multi-volume Oxford English Dictionary above me, and that's the condensed version. The real official version of the OED takes up entire bookcases in libraries. It has 56 million entries. It took a collection of people 73 years to write the OED. They started in 1860. They didn't finish with the Z's until 1933. It took forever to write, 73 years to write. And the way they did it, the way they compiled the dictionary, is that they would go through literary references. And they would go through and see how people are using each word in multiple literary forms, in histories and novels and speeches and letters. And then try to come up with a common definition behind them all. And they tried to do it through the use of volunteers. So they would put calls out for volunteers. People would read these enormous books looking for a particular usage of a particular word, find 8 or 9 versions of this word, create a common definition, and then mail it in. And this would be compared to the similar results that other volunteers were producing. It was all done by mail. And from these literary quotations, the editors would distill a common definition. And that's how they wrote the Oxford English Dictionary. And here's your anecdote. Here's an amusing anecdote. Because it was all done by volunteers, they would often give awards because they couldn't pay them. They would give awards to people who wrote, who sent in a lot of quotations, who wrote a lot of definitions. And one of the people they realized was there was an American doctor who was living in England, and his name was, there he is up above me, Dr. William C. Minor. And he was a physician living in England. And he turned out, he was almost obsessed with the OED. He sent in dozens and dozens, hundreds, indeed thousands, and I believe his final definitional count was upwards in the tens of thousands of definitions. He contributed far more definitions and far more quotations to the Oxford English Dictionary than any other person, not even close. In fact, he wrote a substantial percentage of the comprehensive dictionary of the English language, the OED. And the editors of the dictionary wanted to give Dr. Minor a reward. So they wrote him a letter. They'd never met him because this was all done through correspondence. And they said, we want to show up. We want to give you a medal because your contribution to the English people and the English dictionary is invaluable. You are truly our most valuable volunteer. And then Dr. Minor declined. He declined the award. He says, no, I just want to make my contribution, and I'm just into doing it for the sake of the English people. And besides, he says, where he was, he says, I'm actually very, very hard to get to. He says, I'm actually in the Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane. And therefore, just getting to see me is very, very difficult. And they accepted him, but the editors really wanted to give him this award. They really wanted to give Dr. Minor this award. So they said, you know what? We're actually going to go see Dr. Minor. So they went to the lunatic asylum. They asked for Dr. Minor, and that's when they discovered that Dr. William Minor was not a doctor at the insane asylum. He was a patient. And there he is at the Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, where he spent roughly 30 years. He was a insane paranoid schizophrenic who thought that there were vast plots of the Irish out to kill him. He gunned down a man in cold blood. He was a psychopathic murderer, and who spent the rest of his life locked away in an institute for the criminally insane. So there's your bizarre historical anecdote for the day. The greatest percentage of the Oxford English Dictionary was written by a paranoid schizophrenic. At any rate, when we map out similarities in languages, we look at the language map of Europe, and we see that basically all of Europe, most of the languages of Europe can fit into three major families. We have the Romance languages, which are in green. That's French, Italian, Spanish, the languages we spoke of earlier. We have the Germanic languages. Those are in red. German, Dutch, Danish, Icelandic, and English. Although I think the Irish would wonder why their island is colored red. And in the East, we have the blue. Those are the Slavic languages. Polish, Czech, Russian. And there's a few usual ones. There's Albanian over there in yellow. There's the Baltic languages in light blue. And there are 4 languages that do not fit into any of these large language families: Hungarian, Finnish, Estonian, and Basque. Now, Finnish, Estonian, and Hungarian are all Uralic languages that ultimately come from Central and Northern Asia. They're this scattered set of languages all over the place. And they possibly represent the Aboriginal inhabitants of Europe, their presence dating all the way back to the arrival of the Indo-Europeans. And we're going to meet the Indo-Europeans in just a bit. The Hungarians, we know. The Hungarians, they arrived in the Middle Ages from Central Europe. Of the last of these is the real mystery, which is the Basque language. The Basque language is unlike any other language in Europe, and probably the Basque people are the original Aboriginal civilization of Europe, the descendants of the people who built the great megalithic culture of the Stone Age. The ancestors of the Basque speakers probably built Stonehenge. Now, leaving Europe, let's look at the world as a whole. Here's the language map of the world itself. where the world itself is roughly divided into 38 language families. Furthermore, each of those language families have some degree of similarity. Each of the language families can be tracked as how similar they are to each other and placed into these things called family groups. Hence, you've got Germanic, Celtic, Romance languages, and then all of these languages can be looked at their own similarities, and ultimately it comes into this superfamily of languages. And that superfamily of languages is called Indo-European. The Indo-European languages are the largest and the most widely distributed groups of languages in the world. Indo-European languages are spoken throughout the world. They stretch all the way from Greenland to India and down into Africa. They are very, very widely distributed. If you look at the map above, this is a modern map of language families, which is why the Americas are all covered orange, because it's either mostly English, Spanish, or Portuguese, all of which are Indo-European languages. Basically, if you look at the map above, everything that's in orange is an Indo-European language. And from all these languages, you can look at the similarities and you can reconstruct the ancestral language, of half the world. And this ancestral language is called Proto-Indo-European. This is the ancestral language for most of the world's inhabitants. It probably originated somewhere in either the northern Middle East or the Ukraine around 5000 BC, and then spread both into Europe, going west, and down into the Middle East and into the Indian subcontinent, going east, where it displaced the Basque and Uralic speakers, respectively. Now we get to speak of how did I get that 5000 BC? The 5000 BC date comes from some very fancy statistics, something called Glottal Chronology. Glottal Chronology is the attempt to mathematically model language change over time. It involves that formula up above, where t equals the given amount of time from one stage of the language to another. That's the date. That's the number they're trying to calculate. C is the proportion of word list items at the end of that period, with L being the replacement rate, the rate to which common words drop out. And you have a fancy formula. You study these languages, you line up vocabularies, you look at commonalities, then you crunch the numbers. So you take two word lists from the same language, divide the proportion of words that are similar by the negative value of the rate of replacement, and theoretically, this will give you a number. Theoretically, you can estimate the time period by which those two languages diverged, or the two language families diverged. It does tend to work well for Indo-European languages, and when you apply glottal chronology to known language separation, like with the Romance languages, it tends to work really well. But in other parts of the world with non-Indo-European languages, it's had a much more checkered rate of success. And some people really don't like it at all. Now, here are the results. Here are the glottal chronological results for Indo-European. And it proposes that the original split between the Romance and the Germanic languages occurred roughly 5,500 years BP. It's before present. That's 3,500 years BC. And the split between those two languages and the Celtic languages occurred at 6,100 years BP. That's, of course, 4,000 BC. This has placed the original speakers of Proto-Indo-European language at 8,700 years BP, spoken by a handful of individuals somewhere in either the northern Middle East or southern Russia or the Ukraine, this sort of area just north of the Middle Ages. So how did a language spoken by a group of people who lived in this area end up being spoken by half the world? And this attempt to explain the vast spread of Indo-European has had to go to the archaeological record. And it has led to something that is most traditionally known as the Kurgan Hypothesis, even though some people want to change the name. And the argument is this, that across the steppes of Russia and the Ukraine, you have these funerary structures, and that's what they look like on the upper left, these huge tomb mounds and these huge earthen mounds, and they cover these little tombs at the bottom. Those things are called kurgans. And the people that built those lived in this region roughly between 3000 and 6000 BC. And they're associated with this nomadic, chariot-driving Bronze Age people who inhabited the area. And as you can see from the map on the lower left, the original purple is the proposed homeland of the Kurgans, the Urheimat of the Kurgans. And from there, some of them spread to the west, some of them spread to the east. And recent work on this, you can see the book right above me is one of the most recent and authoritative versions of the Kurgan hypothesis, even though David Anthony does not actually like the term Kurgan. Anyway, the book is The Wheel, the Horse, and Language, and he summarizes and encapsulates what the Kurgan hypothesis is. The Kurgan hypothesis is basically that the people who lived in the area, there's possibly what they looked like, they domesticate the horse, they acquire bronze tools, they develop this nomadic herding lifestyle, and this enables them to spread out militarily and crush and dominate any rivals, and then spread across all that area given above, going all the way from Europe to India, and split into various Kurgan cultures. And these Kurgan cultures were aggressive, they were militaristic. They either enslaved, incorporated, or Kurganized their neighbors, which is to say they would overwhelm a people, but then instead of like just murdering them or wiping them out or expelling them, they would take these conquered people and turn them into Kurgans. And this is done. Other people have done this. This is what the Zulu did down in Africa. It's what the Franks did in the Middle Ages. So they would overwhelm these people, have them acquire horses, chariots, bronze tools, bronze weapons, and their language, which was Proto-Indo-European. And this very successful group of people spread their language all the way from London to Delhi. Now, we've come to the end of talking about the past and Indo-Europeans and dancing macaronis, which is a word we should bring back, the macaroni. Now we're going to move on to syntax and grammar, and we're going to discuss, in the next module, we're going to discuss one of the great debates in linguistics in the next module, and I will see you there.